Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today reacting to news that the country's inflation rate dipped to 2.9% last month, which is just inside the Bank of Canada's target rate range of 1% to 3%. Despite that sliver of good news, cost of living concerns do continue to dominate political debate, including at Queen's Park, where the Ontario legislature has just resumed. Premier Doug Ford is pushing his new rival, Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, to say whether she supports the federal carbon tax. And as you heard just a few moments ago on this program, she won't say. Could slowing inflation eventually lessen the political cost of supporting the price on carbon, or is the so-called axe the tax sentiment baked in? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant is here. He's the CEO of Space Canada. Former Alberta MLA and Cabinet Minister Gary Myr is with us. He's the president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park bureau chief Rob Benzie. Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Good to see you. Gary, I'll start with you. And just on those inflation numbers, you could almost audibly hear the sigh of relief from the Prime Minister that finally it's not terrible news. How much of a relief to governments right now are those inflation numbers, do you think?
Well, I think that it's good news, and I think the Prime Minister should be relieved. But let me say that, as we all know, in politics, sometimes perception is reality. And if you ask the average Canadian, do you feel like you're getting ahead? The answer may be no. And the reason why is because what's not taken into account in this is, you look at rising costs of renting a place to live. And so I think there's still some work to be done. Will the Bank of Canada reduce its prime lending rate come April? We don't know yet. As the Prime Minister has correctly said, that's their decision to make. That's not a political decision. But Tiff Macklin must also share a certain amount of relief, because that is what his mandate is to bring inflation within a certain range. But Canadians are still feeling the cost of living, I would say, and it's not just the cost of the basket of goods that you're buying at a grocery store. It's a whole lot of other things as well.
Yeah, and I think, Rob, Gary's point is really politically salient right now, right? Especially when we talk about Bonnie Crombie, who was just on the show. I know you were covering her at Queen's Park today. There is an intersection politically between the price on carbon, or the carbon tax, and issues around affordability. We've seen the cost of living increase and the popularity of the price on carbon decrease almost basically at the same time. Why do you think Bonnie Crombie is so hesitant to say where she stands on it?
I actually don't understand, Vassy, why she doesn't just say, look, I don't want a provincial carbon tax because we have a federal carbon tax. And the only reason we have a federal carbon tax is Ontarians didn't pay the federal carbon tax until Doug Ford canceled the old cap and trade alliance that Ontario had with Quebec and California, the Western Climate Initiative. So it wasn't really as visible before 2018. Now it's really visible. And I think it's a cost of living concern. And this is why I think Pierre Poilievre has really has really captured lightning in a bottle on that. And it's been, clearly Ford's Conservatives, who are really not close to the federal Conservatives. There's no love lost between these two parties, Vassy. Ford and Poilievre have only ever met once and spoken briefly. And Ford is far closer politically and personally to Prime Minister Trudeau's Liberals than he is to any of the federal Conservatives. But his team sees the carbon tax as something that they can contaminate Bonnie Crombie with, they hope. And they want to tie her to Justin Trudeau, who is unpopular. And maybe it will work. The problem is Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau are as closely aligned as any prime minister and any premier have been that I've seen in the last 20-odd years that I've been covering politics. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, my guess is, Tom, there's a couple of things at play here. First of all, lots of provincial NDP leaders have said now a consumer carbon tax isn't necessary, for example, in the race that's going on in Alberta, or provincial NDPers in Saskatchewan. But Bonnie Crombie has an added layer of needing maybe perhaps the federal Liberal apparatus at some point in her sojourn, and maybe she doesn't want to push them away at this point. What do you think of the balance she's trying to strike?
That's exactly where I was going to go with my comment. I think that she's got to be super careful. There is a tendency in Canada. When Trudeau came to power, there were half a dozen provincial premiers who were Liberals. Today, there are none. If indeed things change in Ottawa, you'll start to see things will change provincially. And I think Bonnie Crombie is lining herself up very well. I don't understand either why she didn't give a clear answer. I think that the worst thing in politics is no answer. And when you try to give no answer on something as crucial as the carbon tax that is being built up, she could have easily started talking about the importance of doing our part to fight climate change, reducing our carbon footprint, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Trudeau blew this one completely. His plan, by the way, is not bad. But they've never explained it well enough for the average Canadian to understand that there is going to be a substantive rebate check for about 8 out of 10 families. Poilievre has his reality that is just sunk in with everybody. This is a tax on everything. This is an old attack, by the way, by conservative parties, not just here, but in Australia. It works. This is a tax on everything that you buy. And so the average Canadian is saying, well, what's going on here? Trudeau, if he was wise, would spend a little bit of money. He's been reticent to do it. He doesn't spend a lot of taxpayers' money explaining his programs. This one should have been explained because it's complicated. And in politics, when it's complicated, you're often going to lose the fight. I think that Crombie is an excellent politician. She should learn from this experience that, yes, she has to keep the Trudeau Liberals in her corner because they're all a big family in Ontario. But at the same time, she's got to be her own person. And if she doesn't learn how to do that, she's going to be in a lot of trouble. Doug Ford will come and eat her lunch.
To be fair to the federal Liberals, Brian, I mean, they don't advertise a lot because they brought in new rules in response to their own criticism of the Harper government back in 2016. But to Tom's point, a lot of the communication has been dominated by opposition criticism of the carbon tax or the price on carbon. If the economic picture, if this is not just a blip and more of a trend, and it does continue to improve, I'll sort of circle back to where I started. Do you think there's still a chance for the argument the federal government has sort of put out there on the virtue, the climate virtue of the price on carbon? Or is axe the tax kind of the dominant way of thinking now?
There's a chance, but I would probably assess it as slim. I think the way that you describe sort of the situation is bang on, and taking comments from all my colleagues here, I think that the idea of a price on carbon pollution is one that has been discussed in Canada for a long time. I was around the table with the First Ministers in 2016 when this was being discussed and negotiated with the Prime Minister and his team. So we've had how many elections? 2 elections, I think, federally since then. So it's not something that's new. What's different now, to Gary's point, is that cost of living is such a major issue that the argument of anything that puts potentially any more price points on anything is a lot more salient. It's connecting a lot more. And of course, calling it a carbon tax, nobody ever likes people that raise taxes. That never really goes well. And it requires a lot of communication and a lot of explanation as to why it's the right move for the country, the province, whatever the case may be. So you're already at a starting point. If it's now, in which we all know it's pretty much called a tax now, axe the tax sounds a lot catchier than a price on carbon pollution. So if it is a tax in people's minds, and that's what the name is, then you're already starting on the wrong foot. And given the cost of living challenges, I think the point is hitting home a lot more than it did in the last few years and in the last federal election campaign. So can it make a comeback with all that I just described? Sure, because I think people did accept it before, but the federal Liberals really have to get their gears going to try to explain to Canadians why this is important and why they think it's the right policy.
You're all such experienced politicians, Gary. What's the political lesson in thinking back to what Brian referenced? 2019 and 2021 were, elections in which the Liberals and the NDP both supported a price on carbon. I remember after the 2021 election, many people saying, look, this is over. It's done. It's a done deal. 2/3 of the population who voted in favor of a carbon tax or a price on carbon. Let's move on. It felt like that was happening. And then lo and behold, 2 and 3 years later, the entire political calculation has changed. What's the lesson out of that?
I think the lesson is that there's so many other factors in play today that weren't around in the 2 elections that Brian referred to. I think that there are just so many factors, whether it's seeing the price of groceries go up. It's because of the cost of things going up, because of breakdowns in supply chains, whether it's the Panama Canal or whether it's the what's going on in the Red Sea. I mean, you've got issues with respect to, housing costs are going up. You've got wages have gone up, But if you look at how wages have gone up in the last really 3 years, it has been, eclipsed by what the cost of inflation has been. So people feel poorer, and so it sounds like a simple solution to axe the tax. I've said before, it's generally not good public policy if you can put it on a T-shirt. So axe the tax is not a particularly good piece of policy. There's a lot more detail to it. And I'm not sure that I agree with Brian that you can actually fix this with communications. I think the die has been set in the minds of voters, and they're going to hold on to this. What's ironic about it is that it will become a hidden tax and not one that is in the open. And so I don't hear anybody talking about getting rid of the tax on industrial emitters, just the consumer carbon tax.
Yes.
And I think that's an important distinction to make. So it's going to be something that I don't think it'll be possible for the Liberals to walk back on this one. I think the die is set in the minds of Canadians.